The flickering neon lights of the old bar cast long shadows across the worn wooden counter.
Stephen sat alone, a figure lost in the haze of whiskey and memories. His glass, perpetually full, mirrored a life lived on the edge, a whirlwind of fleeting pleasures and reckless abandon. He had chased after every desire, indulging in wild parties and countless affairs, his laughter echoing through the emptiness of each fleeting moment.
Years had passed, etching lines on his face and a dull ache in his heart. The thrill of the chase had faded, leaving behind a bitter residue of regret.
His gaze drifted towards the bottom of his glass, the amber liquid swirling with the ghosts of his past. He saw Emily's face, her smile once bright and full of love, now a painful reminder of the trust he had shattered.
Emily.
The name echoed in the silence of his thoughts, a constant reminder of the one true love he had carelessly thrown away. He had pledged his heart to her, vowing to cherish and protect her, yet his actions had spoken a different language. With each betrayal, he chipped away at the foundation of their love, leaving behind a wreckage of broken promises and shattered dreams.
Now, as the weight of his actions pressed down on him, I longed for a chance to turn back time, to rewrite the narrative of my life.
But the past, like the smoke curling from his cigarette, was beyond his grasp. He was left to drown in the suffocating realization that some mistakes, once made, could never be fully erased.
I had been captivated by Emily's beauty from the moment I laid eyes on her. Her laughter was a melody that filled my days with sunshine, her touch a spark that ignited a fire within my soul.
He had pursued her relentlessly, showering her with grand gestures and promises whispered with sincerity. He had believed in those early days that his love for her was strong enough to conquer any storm.
Our wedding day had been a testament to our love, a joyous celebration witnessed by family and friends. Emily, radiant in her white gown, had looked at me with eyes filled with adoration, her heart overflowing with hope for a future by my side.
Stephen, in that moment, had felt like the luckiest man alive, vowing to spend the rest of his days proving himself worthy of her unwavering love.
But time, like a relentless tide, had eroded the foundation of our commitment. I, seduced by the allure of instant gratification, had allowed myself to be swept away by the superficiality of fleeting encounters.
He craved the validation of others' admiration, seeking solace in empty gestures and hollow words. With each indiscretion, the chasm between him and Emily widened.
The light in her eyes, once bright and full of life, slowly dimmed, replaced by a dull ache of disappointment. Her laughter, once a constant melody in our home, became a distant echo, a painful reminder of the joy we had lost.
Stephen, blinded by his own selfish desires, had failed to notice the devastation he was leaving in his wake.
The weight of my sins grew heavier with each passing day, a suffocating burden that clouded even my most reckless indulgences. The once vibrant colours of my world seemed to fade, replaced by a dull, oppressive grey.
The laughter and applause that had once fueled his ego now rang hollow in his ears, a constant reminder of the emptiness that gnawed at his soul.
As the years caught up with me, I found myself confined to a sterile hospital bed, the consequences of my actions finally catching up.
The doctors, with their somber expressions and hushed whispers, painted a grim picture of his fading health. The once invincible charmer was now a frail shadow of his former self, his body ravaged by the consequences of his choices.
The spectre of death, once a distant thought, now loomed large, casting a long, cold shadow over my remaining days. The realization of my mortality struck me with the force of a physical blow, leaving me gasping for breath in the sterile silence of my hospital room.
His past, once a tapestry woven with threads of both pleasure and regret, now unraveled before his eyes. Each broken promise and careless act, a searing indictment of his wasted life.
As the darkness closed in, I longed desperately for a chance to make amends, to seek forgiveness from the one person I had hurt the most, Emily.
But his voice, once filled with confidence and charm, now failed him, reduced to a raspy whisper lost in the vast expanse of his guilt. He was trapped, his heart heavy with unshed tears and unspoken apologies, his soul tethered to the earthly realm by the weight of his remorse. The storm raged outside, mirroring the turmoil that had gripped the small town for days. Rain lashed against the windows of Jake's modest home, the wind howling like a banshee in the night.
Inside, oblivious to the tempestuous night, I sat at my desk, hunched over a pile of books, the warm glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows across the room.
A sudden chill cut through the air, sending a shiver down Jake's spine. He looked up from his books, his gaze drawn to the far corner of the room.
There, partially obscured by the shadows, stood a figure that sent a jolt of fear and disbelief through me.
It was his grandfather, Stephen, his form translucent, his eyes filled with a haunting sadness that seemed to emanate from beyond the grave.
Jake!
Stephen's voice, a low, mournful whisper that seemed to seep from the very walls, broke the stunned silence.
I need your help. I cannot find peace.
Grandpa, is it really you?
Stephen nodded, his ghostly hand reaching out, a crumpled envelope materializing in his grasp.
This letter is for Emily. It is my apology, my confession, my plea for forgiveness. I never found the courage to give it to her while I was alive. You must deliver it for me, Jake. Only then can I find peace.
The morning light painted the kitchen a soft yellow as Jake sat across from his mother, Mary. He nervously pushed his breakfast around his plate, his mind awash with the events of the previous night and the seemingly impossible task his grandfather had given him. He knew he had to tell his mother about Stephen's ghostly visit and the letter, but the words seemed to lodge in his throat, stifled by the fear of her reaction.
Jake, something is troubling you. What is it?
Mary, her brow furrowed in concern, watched her son with a mix of apprehension and motherly intuition. She had always known Jake to be a sensible, grounded young man, not prone to flights of fancy. Yet, there was a palpable tension in his demeanor, a haunted look in his eyes that spoke of a burden far heavier than any school assignment or teenage worry.
Mom, I know it sounds crazy, but I believe him. I have to do this, for him, for Grandma Emily, for all of us.
Jake took a deep breath, steeling himself for her skepticism. He told her everything: the storm, the sudden chill in his room, the ghostly apparition of his grandfather, and the plea to deliver the letter to Emily. As he spoke, the words tumbled out in a torrent of emotion, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and a strange sense of duty to the spectral grandfather he had never truly known.
Jake, honey, I know you're grieving for your grandfather, but you mustn't let your imagination run wild. These stories, they're just that. Stories. We tell them to remember, to honor the past, but we mustn't let them dictate our present.
But Jake was resolute. He knew what he had seen, what he had felt. The weight of the letter, still clutched tightly in his hand, was a tangible reminder of his grandfather's plea from beyond the grave. He looked at his mother, his eyes filled with a conviction that belied his years.
Mom, I know it sounds crazy, but I believe him. I have to do this, for him, for Grandma Emily, for all of us.
The kitchen, usually filled with the comforting aroma of baking bread and the gentle hum of conversation, felt heavy with unspoken tension. Mary, her lips pressed into a thin line, looked at her son, her gaze unwavering. She loved Jake dearly, but the story he had just told her, the fantastical tale of ghostly visitations and pleas from beyond the grave, stretched the limits of her practical, grounded worldview.
Jake, I understand that you want to honor your grandfather's memory, but this quest you're proposing, it's simply not feasible. We don't have the means for such a journey, and frankly, I'm not convinced it's necessary.
Jake, his shoulders slumping slightly under the weight of his mother's doubt, clutched the letter tighter in his hand. He had anticipated her skepticism, but hearing her dismiss his experience so readily stung. He knew it sounded far-fetched, even to his own ears, but the encounter with Stephen's ghost had felt undeniably real, the weight of his grandfather's remorse palpable in the air.
But Mum, what if it's true? What if Grandpa Stephen is trapped, unable to find peace because of this undelivered letter? Don't we owe it to him, to Grandma Emily, to at least try?
Mary sighed, her gaze softening as she reached out to touch her son's hand. She saw the determination in his eyes, the unwavering belief in something she couldn't see or understand. She knew that simply dismissing his experience as a figment of his imagination wouldn't ease his mind or quell the sense of responsibility that had taken root within him. The days that followed were a blur of routine and quiet determination. Jake, true to his word, threw himself into his work at the local grocery store, his shifts stretching late into the evening. He picked up extra hours whenever possible, diligently stashing away every dollar earned, each penny bringing him one step closer to fulfilling his promise to his grandfather. At night, exhausted but resolute, Jake would retreat to his room, the crumpled letter his constant companion. He would trace the faded ink with his fingers, imagining his grandfather's hand writing those words, pouring his heart out onto the page. He knew nothing of the letter's contents, but he felt the weight of its significance, the unspoken emotions it held captive within its folds. One evening, while sorting through a box of old belongings in the attic, Jake stumbled upon a small, intricately carved wooden box. Curiosity piqued. He lifted the lid, revealing a single, solitary mustard seed nestled in a bed of faded velvet. He picked it up, its rough texture a stark contrast to the smooth wood of the box. As he turned the tiny seed over in his hands, his grandmother's voice echoed in his mind, her words from a long-ago Sunday school lesson resurfacing with newfound clarity. "If you have faith as small as a mustard seed," she had said, her eyes twinkling, "nothing will be impossible for you." The mustard seed became a tangible symbol of Jake's own burgeoning faith, a reminder that even the smallest act of belief could move mountains. He tucked it carefully into his pocket, a constant companion to the letter, a silent testament to his unwavering determination to fulfill his grandfather's dying wish.
Weeks turned into months, each day marked by my quiet sacrifice. I gave up outings with friends, my social life shrinking to accommodate my demanding work schedule. I ate simple meals, my usual appetite for pizza and burgers, replaced by a steady diet of ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches, each bite a reminder of the purpose behind my self-imposed austerity. At times, the weight of my self-imposed burden felt overwhelming. I would come home from work, my body aching with fatigue, my mind numb from the monotony of stocking shelves and ringing up groceries. There were moments when doubt would creep in, whispering insidious suggestions that I was being foolish, that my quest was futile, that my grandfather was truly gone, and this letter was nothing more than a cruel trick of my grieving mind. But then, I would remember the look in my grandfather's eyes, the palpable sorrow and regret that had emanated from his spectral form. I would picture my grandmother, her face etched with years of unspoken pain, and I would feel a renewed surge of determination. I had made a promise, not just to my grandfather's ghost, but to myself, to honor the memory of a love that, despite its flaws, had once burned bright. And so I pressed on, my resolve fueled by a potent mix of guilt, love, and a burgeoning hope that my small act of redemption could somehow heal the wounds of the past. The mustard seed in my pocket became a talisman, a physical manifestation of the faith that kept me going, a silent reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, even the smallest seed of belief could blossom into something extraordinary.
I watched my son from afar, my heart heavy with a mixture of pride and concern. I had initially dismissed Jake's story as a symptom of grief, a way for him to process the loss of a grandfather he had barely known. But as the weeks turned into months, I couldn't deny the change I saw in him. Gone was the carefree teenager who had once filled our home with laughter and the boisterous energy of youth. In his place stood a young man, hardened by sacrifice, his eyes reflecting a maturity beyond his years. He moved with a quiet determination, his every action infused with a sense of purpose that both intrigued and worried me. One evening, as Jake came home from work, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion, I found myself overcome with a wave of maternal protectiveness. I longed to tell him to stop, to let go of this self-imposed burden, to reclaim the carefree spirit of his youth. But as I watched him collapse onto the sofa, a crumpled envelope clutched tightly in his hand, a different emotion washed over me, a grudging respect for his unwavering commitment. I remembered my own father, Stephen, the man who had broken my mother's heart with his reckless choices. I recalled the years of unspoken pain, the bitterness that had lingered long after he was gone. And for the first time, I began to understand the true purpose behind Jake's quest. It wasn't just about delivering a letter, it was about offering a chance for healing, for closure, for a family haunted by the past to finally find peace. It was about redemption, not just for a wayward grandfather, but for a grandson determined to right the wrongs of a previous generation. The silence in the kitchen was broken only by the ticking of the old clock on the wall. I stood by the window, the faint glow of the streetlights casting long shadows across my face. I had been watching Jake as he slept, his features etched with exhaustion, the crumpled envelope still clutched tightly in his hand. A wave of guilt washed over me. I had been so caught up in my own skepticism, my own practical worldview, that I had failed to see the depth of my son's commitment, the quiet nobility of his mission. He was trying to heal a wound that had festered in our family for generations, a wound I had unwittingly kept open with my own bitterness and resentment. I thought of my mother, Emily, now living a quiet life in a distant town, the memory of Stephen's betrayal still casting a long shadow over her golden years. I had always encouraged her to move on, to let go of the past, but deep down, I knew that some wounds ran too deep to ever truly heal. Turning away from the window, I quietly approached the table where Jake's meager savings were laid out, each dollar a testament to his unwavering determination. I reached into my purse and pulled out a wad of bills, my own hard-earned money, saved for a rainy day. As I added my contribution to Jake's growing pile, a silent understanding passed between mother and son, a bridge built on shared grief, unspoken forgiveness, and the enduring power of love.
Section 2, The Journey Begins. The Greyhound bus rumbled along the highway, carrying Jake further and further away from everything familiar.
He gazed out the window at the passing scenery, a blur of trees and towns, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. Excitement warred with apprehension, hope with a lingering fear of the unknown. He clutched the worn leather bag on his lap, its weight a comforting reminder of his purpose.
Inside, nestled among a few spare clothes and a dog-eared paperback, lay the letter and the small wooden box containing the mustard seed. They were his talismans, his anchors in a sea of uncertainty.
The journey was long and arduous. The air inside the bus was thick with the scent of stale coffee and exhaust fumes. The drone of the engine and the chatter of his fellow passengers faded into a dull roar as Jake retreated into his own thoughts. He thought of his grandfather, the man he had never really known but whose presence now loomed large in his life. He tried to imagine the circumstances surrounding the letter, the emotions that had compelled Stephen to pen those words. Was it a deathbed confession? A desperate plea for forgiveness from beyond the grave? Or was it something more, a message of love, a final attempt to bridge the chasm that had separated him from the woman he had loved and lost? The bus pulled into the station with a tired sigh, its arrival announced by a chorus of hissing brakes and the disgruntled murmurs of disembarking passengers. Jake stepped off the bus, his legs stiff from the long journey, and into the unfamiliar quiet of the small town. The air was fresh and crisp, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth. It was a welcome change from the city's cacophony of noise and exhaust fumes. Jake took a deep breath, feeling a sense of calm settle over him.
He hailed a taxi and gave the driver Emily's address. The ride was short, taking him through quiet, tree-lined streets lined with cozy-looking homes. As the taxi pulled up outside a modest, white-painted bungalow, a wave of nervous anticipation washed over him. This was it, the culmination of months of planning, sacrifice, and unwavering faith.
He rang the doorbell and waited, his heart pounding in his chest. A moment later, the door opened, revealing a woman. Her hair was silver now, her face etched with the passage of time, but her eyes, still bright and full of life, held a spark of recognition.
"Jake?" she asked, her voice a gentle whisper that sent a shiver down his spine. It was the voice from his childhood, the voice that had lulled him to sleep with bedtime stories and filled his grandmother's kitchen with warmth and laughter.
"Grandma Emily?" he replied, his voice catching in his throat.
A wave of emotions washed over Emily's face, surprise, disbelief, and a flicker of cautious hope.
"Jake, my dear boy, what are you doing here?"
Taking a deep breath, Jake stepped forward, holding out the worn leather bag. "I'm here for Grandpa Stephen," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "He sent me."
Emily's brow furrowed, a mixture of confusion and apprehension clouding her features.
"Stephen?" she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. The name, once a source of both joy and pain, now hung heavy in the air between them. a ghost from a past she had long tried to outrun.
Jake's grip tightened on the leather bag, his fingers tracing the outline of the letter inside. He could feel the weight of his grandmother's gaze upon him, the unspoken questions swirling in her eyes. It was now or never. He had come too far, sacrificed too much, to turn back now.
He came to me, Grandma, Jake began, his voice catching in his throat. He told her everything. The stormy night, the sudden chill in his room, the spectral apparition of his grandfather, his eyes filled with remorse, his voice heavy with unshed tears. He described the plea for redemption, the desperate request to deliver the letter, the promise of peace that had spurred him on this improbable journey.
As Jake spoke, he watched Emily closely, gauging her reaction. He saw the initial flicker of disbelief, the instinctive urge to dismiss his story as a young man's grief-stricken delusion. But he also saw something else in her eyes, a flicker of recognition, a deep-seated longing for something she had thought lost forever. Closure.
With trembling hands, Emily took the letter from Jake. The paper was old, the ink faded, the edges softened by time. It felt fragile in her grasp, like a whisper from a distant past. For a moment, she hesitated, a wave of conflicting emotions washing over her. Fear warred with curiosity, anger with a deep-seated yearning for closure. Memories, vivid and painful, flooded back. She saw Stephen's face, young and full of life, his eyes filled with a love that she had believed, with all her heart, would last a lifetime. She felt the sting of betrayal, the sharp, agonizing pain of his repeated indiscretions, the slow erosion of trust that had poisoned their love.
With a shaky breath, Emily began to read. The words, penned by a man she thought she had buried long ago, seemed to jump off the page, each sentence a testament to the depth of his regret, his longing for a forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve. Stephen's words were raw, unflinching in their honesty. He held nothing back, confessing his failings, acknowledging the pain he had caused, the trust he had shattered. He wrote of his love for her, a love that, despite his countless betrayals, had never truly died. He begged for her forgiveness, not for his own peace of mind, but for hers. He wanted her to be free from the bitterness, the resentment, the what-ifs that had haunted her for so long.
As the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the room, Emily finished reading the letter. Tears streamed down her face, a mixture of sorrow, anger, and a bittersweet relief she hadn't expected to feel. She looked up at Jake, her eyes shining with a newfound clarity. "Thank you, Jake," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. This changes everything." She reached out and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Your grandfather, he was a complicated man," she said, a hint of sadness tinging her words. "He made mistakes, terrible mistakes, that hurt a lot of people, me most of all. But deep down, beneath the charm and the recklessness, there was goodness in him. He loved me, in his own way, and this letter, it proves that."
Jake, his own eyes welling up, nodded. He didn't need to understand the complexities of their relationship, the years of hurt and resentment, to recognize the healing power of forgiveness.
That night, as Jake lay in the guest room of his grandmother's house, a profound sense of peace washed over him. He thought of his grandfather, no longer a distant figure from faded photographs, but a man who, despite his flaws, had loved deeply and regretted his mistakes. And for the first time since that stormy night, Jake felt a sense of closure, knowing that he had played a small part in bringing peace to two souls long estranged. The small motel room was bathed in the soft glow of the bedside lamp, casting long shadows across the worn floral patterns on the wallpaper. Jake lay awake, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions after the day's events. He thought of his grandmother, her face etched with years of unspoken pain, finally finding a sense of closure with the arrival of Stephen's letter.
A sudden chill swept through the room, and Jake sat up in bed, his heart pounding in his chest. There at the foot of the bed stood his grandfather, Stephen. But this time there was a distinct difference. The sorrow that had weighed so heavily upon his features had lifted. A soft golden light emanated from him, illuminating the room with an otherworldly warmth.
Jake, Stephen's voice, no longer a mournful whisper, but a clear, resonant tone, filled the room. You did it. You gave Emily my letter, and in doing so, you freed us both.
A wave of relief washed over Jake, leaving him weak with emotion. He had fulfilled his promise, had shouldered the burden of his grandfather's regret, and delivered his heartfelt apology to the woman he had wronged.
Thank you, Jake, Stephen continued, his voice filled with gratitude. You've given me the greatest gift imaginable. Peace, the torment, the guilt, the endless wandering. It's all gone. I can finally move on.
The Greyhound bus pulled into the station, its arrival a symphony of hissing brakes and the murmur of disembarking passengers. Jake stepped off the bus, stretching his stiff muscles after the long journey home. The familiar sights and sounds of his small town welcomed him back, yet he knew he had returned a changed young man. He had faced challenges he never imagined, had stared into the face of the unknown, and emerged stronger, more compassionate, forever marked by his extraordinary encounter with his grandfather's spirit. He had learned the true meaning of forgiveness, the transformative power of compassion, and the enduring strength of familial bonds, even in the face of betrayal and loss. As he approached his house, he saw his mother standing on the porch, her arms crossed, her brow furrowed with concern. He knew she had been worried sick, her practical mind struggling to reconcile itself with the fantastical nature of his quest. But as he drew closer, he noticed something different in her expression. The worry line seemed to have softened, replaced by a flicker of tentative pride.
"Mom," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion as he rushed towards her.
Mary opened her arms, pulling her son into a tight embrace. Oh, Jake, she whispered, her voice choked with relief. You're home.
As they stood there, bathed in the warm glow of the porch light, a sense of understanding passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the profound journey they had both undertaken. Jake had faced his fears, had bridged the gap between the living and the dead, and in doing so, had helped heal a wound that had festered in their family for far too long. In that moment, the ghost of his grandfather appeared once more, his form bathed in an ethereal light. With a peaceful smile, his soul began to ascend to heaven, finally at rest.